In February 1917, the workers of Petrograd were joined by tens of thousands of women on International Women's Day for the strike that brought down the Russian Empire. 5 years prior, women similarly joined the workers of Brisbane in one of the first general strikes in Australia's history. And like the people in Petrograd, people in Brisbane began to immediately construct a new society in the conflict of the old along directly democratic lines. In the late 19th and 20th century, Brisbane's tramways were privately owned by a London company managed by the American Joseph Badger. As early as 1904, the workers of the tramways company tried to form their own unions, but the organisers were subsequently fired. The company did create its own phantom union in an attempt to stifle the movements of its workforce. Finally, a group of workers were able to file for registration to the federal court and successfully were recognised in 1910. The tensions between the union and Badger escalated on the 15th of January 1912, when the union was delivered badges for members to publicly wear at work. This was a step too far for Badger, who basically said to the union and its workers, you either get rid of the badges or you're fired. The union organised a demonstration of 10,000 people that same night, where federal and state Labour Party ministers and union organisers spoke and held public meetings. Police were present and were reportedly brutal in how they dealt with the moving crowd. Given the heightened police presence and lack of reception at the arbitration court, the unions under the Australian Labour Federation met to decide on what to do. By the 28th of January, the 43 unions had voted unanimously for a general strike. The Queensland Labour Party was intertwined with the whole ordeal, with the Minister J. Harry Coyne elected as president of the strike committee. The party was, given its reformist predilections, unusually receptive and cooperative with the rank and file's direct strike action, either indicating a break from the support for arbitration or an intention to use the movement as a springboard to get out of opposition and win the state elections. Either way, the unions and the party, through the authority of the strike committee, took over Brisbane and put parts of Queensland to a standstill. Food and retail stores were allowed to run, granted they were given a permit issued by the committee, that they used union labour, and that they used the coupons issued instead of currency. These coupons were distributed and guaranteed by the committee. 500 vigilante officers were appointed by the committee as replacement for the police, and the committee even organised its own ambulances. A newspaper, the Strike Bulletin, was established as a means to counter the otherwise hostile press. On day one of the strike, the front page read, "Today the toilers refuse to toil and all commerce, all industry is paralysed. Tomorrow when the workers of the world unite, no government can exist except by their mandate." For the next few weeks, the strikers operated as the ruling government of Brisbane. The then Conservative government requested Commonwealth troops from the federal government, which at the time was run by the Labour Party. The Federal Party refused to help the Conservative state government, but it also refused to aid the striking workers. The committee's request for aid and industrial action to other states was met by apprehension and silence, with unions in other states expressing sympathy but not support for the strike. On the 2nd of February, the Conservative state government had denied the protest permit submitted by the strike committee and sent down 3,000 extra special police officers to deal with the crowds. The committee leadership were nervous and apprehensive towards directly challenging the authority of the state and had told the workers they ought to be lawful and avoid violence with the police. Despite this, the police and protesters nonetheless clashed and escalated to a point where these special units came in and began beating the protesters with batons indiscriminately. This event was known as Black Friday. The fate of the Brisbane strike, regarded as a general affair, was probably decided when David Bowman surged up, a hatless but honest man, between the strikers' procession and the police, and urged that the law should be obeyed and all violence carefully avoided. By that decision was then arrived at, his party abandoned the only weapon by which it could possibly achieve a victory. While the pickets remained for a few weeks, the processions in the city stopped altogether. Even these pickets began to fall away as the strike committee didn't prepare enough provisions and supplies, for they were relying on unions in other states to join in and offer supplies. While the Russian Revolution did begin in Petrograd, it conversely spread like wildfire. Cities across the country were paralysed by strike action. It got to a point that many police and soldiers lost faith in the Tsar. What the people in Brisbane showed is that if the interstate unions had answered the strike committee's call, if the leadership had been more willing, then a similar situation in Australia may have been possible. While the workers won the right to wear a badge, the win was disproportionate compared to the action and energy at the strike. The combination of partisan leadership, a lack of adequate preparation and supplies, the latter of which was enabled by the former, is what led to the strike's defeat. The Queensland Labor leadership were, for all their verbose rhetoric, completely uninterested in directly challenging state power. This is because the Labor Party was, and still arguably is, a bunch of people who see themselves as competent politicians, statecraftsmen, and representatives who can benevolently wield state power. But by submitting themselves to the foremost coercive tool of class domination, that being the government, they themselves become incorporated within it. They may be marginally or substantially better for working people than their conservative counterparts, yet they wield unilateral power, which at the root of it keeps in check current class relations, whereby you have dominating classes and dominated classes.
I lead a government that is proudly pro-business and pro-worker.
So even if they were elected to hold power on behalf of working people, by virtue of holding that power, they become part of that dominating class. As much as social democrats and revolutionary socialists hate each other and see themselves as the true manifestation of working class politics, I think there's a common underlying weakness here. The vanguard party, like the Social Democrats, sees its role as leading and guiding the masses, but unlike the Social Democrats, it is guiding people towards the direct usurpation of power as opposed to participating in elections. And rather than centering power within the dominated classes that these parties are supposed to represent, the informed, competent representatives and politicians are entrusted with said power. Unlike the Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks didn't become incorporated with the then ruling classes, but by appropriating the state and centering its authority within the leadership of the party, they molded a new ruling class, and in some ways attaching itself to the old. They called this the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the workers weren't necessarily empowered or dictating society. The power they did have couldn't really directly challenge the authority of the political party state power centralized in the Sovnarkom. Just like the Social Democrats, the vanguardists didn't have working people to directly challenge state power, they wanted to wield state power on behalf of them. Now, there are a million reasons given by both Social Democrats and vanguardists as to why their respective political projects didn't live up to expectations. The Bolsheviks, after all, were in the middle of a devastating civil war and had become isolated after the revolutions of Europe faltered. I think, however, there are more lessons we can learn from these examples. It wasn't necessarily the Labor Party that the Queensland government feared, it was the actions the Labor Party, through the strike committee, seemed to endorse. The fact that the committee became an alternative government that issued coupons, mandated unionised labour, ran its own services, was the thing that the ruling classes feared, not the partisan branding on it. Likewise, it was what the Bolsheviks represented. They represented all power to the worker councils, the abolition of classes. After the Bolsheviks had abandoned those mantras, Tsarist officers and officials began to work for the government again, and companies began to reinvest and profit once more. Instead of relying on that middleman, the party, we should directly and immediately implement the threats they represent. The Bolsheviks were successful in leveraging dual power, or the creation of new institutions and systems within the current society that directly counter existing institutions and systems. For example, in Russia, you had two existing governments, the provisional government after the Tsar abdicated, and you had the worker councils or the Soviets, which governed through collective strength. The 1912 Brisbane strike was an example of very early stage dual power. As the committee ran Brisbane as the alternative government, it immediately set up institutions and systems that broke away from the old. In a period of renewed industrial militancy, one where Australian unions are increasingly disenfranchised with the Labor Party leadership, I think the lessons history can teach us are valuable. The party won't hold your best interests as a unionist at heart. It seeks to hold and wield state power, and this inherent desire to benevolently manage the current system, not to rid society of its contradictions, conservatizes a political party. It makes it more amicable and interested in what the ruling classes have to say. After all, those who rule us own the property, the companies, they have the best lobbyists, the best lawyers, the capital, the money for donations. Getting on those guys' side is much more appealing. So we shouldn't rely on a political party to benignly keep our interests at heart. We shouldn't censor political change around a party. Instead, we should build the things that they supposedly represent, and we don't need them to do it.